My name is Elise. I'm 32 years old, and I wasn't invited. The reunion was held at my grandfather's estate, that sprawling old house on the edge of Silver Lake, where the wooden steps groaned under childhood summers and the smell of lake water mixed with sunblock and secrets. I saw it through a stranger's Instagram story. Her tag said, "Russian Grayson family legacy," and there they were. My mother, my uncle, my cousin with her new baby, laughing on the wraparound porch, holding wine glasses with the same hands that once braided my hair. I wasn't mentioned. Not once. They knew I lived just 40 minutes away. They knew I was off that weekend. They knew I still brought homemade jam to Grandad's old neighbour every few weeks, just to keep the tradition going. But my name was never on the group text. I never received an email, not even a pity-forwarded Facebook invite. I stood in my tiny kitchen that morning. In the apartment, they all pretend not to know I rent above a laundromat. I wore a dress I never got to wear to my cousin's wedding, the one I helped pay for. I watched that video on mute, over and over, trying to guess what they were saying behind the smiles. It was like watching ghosts live out the life I was erased from. It didn't used to be like this. When my dad died, I became the designated peacemaker. I was only 15, but I learned to check in on my mother when she went quiet for too long, or gently excuse her tired spells when she missed birthdays. I became a master of distraction. I could feel when a conversation was about to turn, and I'd pivot, offer a compliment, spill a drink, tell a joke. I smoothed edges no one knew were cutting me. I built bridges no one else wanted to cross. I stitched the family together like a seamstress with a needle in her chest. But lately, they stopped crossing back. The first time I really noticed was last year. Christmas. My name wasn't on the Secret Santa list. Mum said it was a mistake. That they assumed I might be busy with work. But I work in freelance publishing. There is no such thing as too busy for Christmas. I smiled anyway. I told them it was fine. That I liked giving without expecting. That maybe I'd just pick someone at random and surprise them. I wrapped a gift for Aunt Maggie, rosemary hand lotion and a scarf I hand-knitted. She didn't open it. She left it on the table and told the others she wasn't sure who it was from. That was the first crack I couldn't seal shut. Now, it's June, and they've made it clear I'm not part of the story anymore. I didn't cry. I didn't text anyone. I didn't post a bitter quote or vague status. Instead, I brewed coffee. I fed the neighbour's cat. I stared at the box on the top shelf of my closet, the one I hadn't opened in 6 years. Then, I did. Inside was a single photo. Me and my father, sitting on that same porch at Silver Lake. He's holding me, one hand resting on my knee, the other holding up a blueprint. My legs are covered in crayon. I remember that day. He told me, "You don't need an invitation to something you built." The house was his. The land, too. He left it in trust. And somehow, quietly, they'd let his name fade. I spent the next 3 hours on the phone. I called Morgan, the lawyer who used to clerk with my dad back in the day. I asked for a copy of the trust. She hesitated. I could feel the shock through the line when she realised who I was. Elise Grayson. "Yes," I said calmly. "That's still my name." There was a long silence. Then she said, "You may want to come in." I did. And when I left, I wasn't holding a grudge. I was holding paperwork. The kind that proves the past can't be rewritten, no matter how many Instagram filters they use. The next morning, I called the Limo service, and I gave them an address. Then I told them the name of the one person none of them ever expected to see again. And that's when everything started to change. The limo pulled up to the estate just as the sun began to soften into that golden hue, like the universe was holding its breath. The driver stepped out, crisply dressed, unbothered by the long gravel path that curled like a secret around the trees. The house stood proud at the top of the slope, music playing low, the sounds of clinking glasses and laughter drifting out like ghosts with perfect teeth. I wasn't there. I watched it unfold from a quiet distance, a parked car down the road, the same way they had watched me vanish from their lives, slowly, without ever asking why. They didn't notice the limo at first, too busy posing for group photos. My cousin's husband had a drone camera buzzing overhead like a mechanical fly, trying to capture legacy. That word, the one they whispered behind closed doors when they thought I couldn't hear. She doesn't understand the legacy. I understood more than they did. I was part of it. I had lived the quiet parts, the bloody parts, the parts they edited out of their polished speeches, and I had the proof, more than they ever imagined. The limo door opened, and out stepped her, Frances, my father's sister, the one they never talk about, the one they blamed for everything, the one they buried in rumour, exile and shame, and the only one who ever told me the truth. She hadn't been back in over 2 decades, not since the argument that split the family, the night my grandfather declared her dead to him for siding with my father. I was too young to remember the details, but I remember the silence afterward, the way her name was scrubbed from photos, the way my mother flinched when I asked who she was. Frances sent me birthday cards when no one else did, always unsigned, always in the same slanted handwriting. Inside each one, a single pressed flower and a word, remember. The gasps were audible. My aunt spilled her sangria. My cousin took a step back, bumping into a flower arrangement that crashed like a glass heartbeat on the porch floor. No one moved toward Frances. No one embraced her. Not even my mother. Frances stood still, calm, almost regal in her navy blue coat. She held a leather folder in one hand, the trust documents. I had made sure she knew what to bring. She scanned the crowd, and then she said the first words anyone had spoken with any truth in years. I was invited, my mother blinked. By who? Frances raised her chin slightly. Elise. A single syllable. A name that landed like thunder in a chapel. Their silence was my confirmation. She walked forward then, slow but steady, like she wasn't afraid of the past anymore. I watched from the car, heart pounding not with fear but something deeper. A release, like a knot was finally loosening in my chest. I didn't need to be there. Not yet. My absence was louder than any confrontation. Inside that folder was the original copy of the property deed. It bore my father's signature, the one that named me co-beneficiary of the land, with Frances as guardian until I turned 25. It had never been updated, never revoked, just ignored, like me. They had hosted a celebration on land that didn't solely belong to them, and now they knew. Frances didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse or insult. She simply handed the folder to my uncle, his face pale as he flipped the pages. He knew. He must have known, or maybe he had hoped it had all gone away when my father died, that if they stopped saying my name long enough, I'd forget who I was. They were wrong. When I drove away, I didn't feel victorious. I felt clean, like I had finally pulled the thorn from my side. It wasn't revenge. It was remembrance. Frances called me that evening. Her voice was exactly as I remembered. Soft, like dusk, like a memory that never asked to be forgiven. She didn't say, "Thank you." She didn't need to. We'd both lived in the shadows of that house long enough to know that words weren't the currency they spent in our family. Truth was. Paperwork was. Survival was. "I stayed for an hour," she said quietly. "Long enough for your mother to pretend it was some sort of mix-up. Long enough for your uncle to realise I wasn't bluffing." I could hear her stepping through grass on the other end of the line. The way leaves crunched under her shoes. I pictured her walking along the lake path behind the house, the one my father used to take me on when I couldn't sleep, telling me that grief never disappears, it just moves deeper into the water. "They didn't even offer me tea," Francis added. There was a short laugh. Not bitter, just tired. I asked her how they reacted once they read the final page. The moment they saw your name, the room split in half. Some of them looked like they'd seen a ghost, others like they'd lost something they didn't even know they were holding. I could imagine it. The discomfort, the scrambling, the group texts beneath the dinner table, the way my cousin probably tried to redirect the energy, like she always did, hosting people through tension with 2 big smiles and extra servings of potato salad. I didn't ask if my mother said anything. I didn't want to know. Not yet. Instead, I said, "Did you tell them I was coming?" She paused. "No," she said. "That part's still yours to decide." I sat there, in the apartment they always made me feel ashamed of, and realised I didn't need to show up right away. This wasn't a dramatic reveal. It wasn't a soap opera twist. This was about silence, about letting the truth sit in their mouths long enough to make them taste it. Later that night, I saw another Instagram post. Same porch, same family, but this time no hashtags. Just a blurry photo of the sunset, with the caption, "Some people never really leave, they just wait." I smiled. It had taken years to learn that not every wound needs to scream. That sometimes the loudest message is no message at all. I didn't call. I didn't gloat. I went to work the next day. I made edits on a manuscript. No one in my family knew I was ghostwriting for a New York Times best-selling author. I paid my bills. I fed the cat. And then I started to gather the rest of the pieces. Because what they didn't know, what they still didn't know, was that this wasn't the first time they'd cut me out. There had been something else. Something hidden, deeper than a seating chart or a forgotten birthday. The real betrayal. It started with a folder I found when I was 19. Buried in a box my mother kept in the back of her closet, behind a pile of old holiday linens. I had been helping her look for an old photo album, and she left me alone in the room. It wasn't labelled, but inside was a birth certificate. Mine. Only my last name wasn't Grayson. It was Harper. Elise Harper. Father Daniel Harper. Not Richard Grayson, my mother's late husband. The man I had mourned, idolised, built my identity around. The man I thought had loved me unconditionally. I sat on the floor of that closet for an hour, just staring at it. My hands went numb. My legs too. I didn't say anything when my mother came back. I just nodded when she asked if I found the album. I never told anyone, not even Francis, because I didn't know what to do with it. But now I did. It was time to go deeper than property lines. It was time to uncover the bloodlines. The first time I saw a photo of Daniel Harper, I was 26. I had searched his name late at night, after 3 glasses of wine and a week of insomnia. At the time, I told myself it was just curiosity, a passing impulse. But the truth is, I was unravelling, quietly, carefully, like a sweater pulled loose by one stubborn thread. He looked nothing like the man I was raised to call Dad. Daniel had sharper features. Olive-toned skin, deep-set eyes that didn't smile. There was a faint scar near his left temple, barely visible unless the light caught it right. I saved that photo to my computer, then immediately deleted it. Then searched again, and again. Eventually, I stopped pretending it didn't matter. I found old news articles, local ones buried in university archives. He'd been a professor once. Literature. Published essays on post-war identity and fractured narratives. The irony didn't escape me. He had once spoken on fractured identity while I lived it. According to records, he died in a car accident 2 months before I turned 2. My mother had erased him like he never existed. She remarried 3 years later, to Richard Grayson, the man whose name I carried, whose legacy I was forced to wear like a borrowed dress. Too stiff, too tight, never mine. I never understood why. Why lie? Why raise me in a house built on someone else's name? Why build an entire legacy around a mission? The answers, I assumed, were buried with him. Until I remembered something. My father, Richard, he used to keep journals, leather-bound ones, stacked neatly in the corner of his study. When I was a child, I wasn't allowed to touch them. My mother said they were private. I never saw her read them, never saw anyone read them. When he died, I assumed she burned them, like she did his letters and clothes and anything that reminded her of the man she pretended had fathered me. But she hadn't. Last week, I returned to the house under the guise of civility. I brought Francis with me. That gave them enough unease to behave. My mother greeted us with a thin smile, the kind that looked pasted on with effort. She asked if I wanted tea. I said no. Then I asked to see his study. She blinked. It hasn't been touched in years. Exactly. The journals were still there. 12 volumes. One for each year they'd been married. The spines were dusty, the leather cracked. I opened the first one like I was defusing a bomb, and there it was. A single line that shifted everything I knew Elise wasn't mine the moment she was born. But I loved her anyway. God help me. I closed the book. The room spun. I was real. My memories were real. But the story they built around me was fiction. Frances drove me home. I didn't say much. She didn't ask. She had always known something was off. I sat alone that night, rereading the scanned copy of my birth certificate. I studied my own name like it belonged to someone else. Elise Harper. I whispered it into the empty apartment, just to see how it felt. It didn't feel wrong. It felt like opening a window I hadn't realised was painted shut. The next day, I called a geneticist. I submitted a DNA test, not because I needed validation, but because I wanted records. Facts. Something no one in my family could twist or discredit. While I waited for the results, I started researching Daniel Harper's estate. He hadn't left much behind. No surviving siblings, no wife, no known will. But he had one thing, an unfinished manuscript, still in university archives, still unpublished, still credited to an anonymous donor who had paid the university to preserve it. I didn't need to guess who the donor was. My mother had protected his memory, just not for me. It was always about her image, her choices, her shame. But I wasn't going to carry that silence anymore. I printed the manuscript. It was titled The Quiet Inheritance. And as I began to read, I realised something. He had written about me. The manuscript wasn't polished. It was raw margins filled with cross-outs, loops of regret, half sentences where he must have lost his nerve. But the words were unmistakably his. A man who had made peace with the fact that he wouldn't live to raise his daughter, but couldn't bear the idea of her growing up without ever knowing him. He wrote about a girl he would never meet. He wrote about her favourite colour sea glass green, about how she might walk like her mother but laugh like him, about how, in some parallel life, they would have read Neruda poems together in the garden while she played with worms and asked if stars made noise when they blinked. I read it all in one sitting. 54 pages of imagined memories. By the time I reached the final paragraph, I was crying into my sleeves. Not loud, not messy, just quiet, steady grief that had waited 30 years to be allowed out. The last line read, "If she ever finds this, I hope she knows I didn't leave. I was taken, but she was never abandoned." I folded the last page slowly, and something inside me cracked wide open. My whole life, I had been told I was too sensitive, too emotional, too dramatic, that I twisted things, took things too personally. I believed them for a long time, thought it was my fault when people drifted, when my mother winced at my presence, when my family kept me just close enough to smile at, but never close enough to rely on. Now, I knew better. It wasn't me they were avoiding. It was the truth. The manuscript wasn't a bomb. It was a mirror. And I was ready to hold it up to every single person who had looked at me and seen only the parts they could use or erase. I scanned the entire thing and made backup copies. One on a USB drive I wore around my neck now. One emailed to myself from a burner account, and one printed and sealed inside an envelope, marked with a single line. For the reunion you forgot to invite me to, that envelope would find its way back to the Grayson estate. But not yet. I needed to prepare, because if I was going to make them see, I had to be deliberate, calm, unshakable. First, I booked a dinner reservation. Not at some fancy place, somewhere. Symbolic. A little bistro by the lake. One they used to take me to when I was small, before they decided who belonged and who didn't. It was still there, still had the same worn wooden chairs and sticky menus, and that one server who wore too much perfume. Then I made the calls. I called my cousin Celia first, the one with the baby, the one who had once let me sleep on her couch for 3 nights when I fled a toxic relationship and didn't want to tell anyone. She hadn't known the full story, but she hadn't asked questions. That counted for something. I told her I needed to talk. Just her. No drama, no performance. She hesitated. I could hear the conflict in her throat. Finally, she said yes. Then, one by one, I reached out to others. Not all of them replied, but enough did. Enough to know that the cracks were already spreading. Celia was the first to show up. She hugged me like nothing had happened. Like maybe she was just waiting for permission. "I never knew," she whispered. "I didn't say anything. I just handed her the manuscript, told her to read it on her own time. And when she did, 2 days later, she called me in tears. 'Elise,' she said, 'I think it's time.' I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Yes, it was time. The morning of the second dinner. I didn't wear anything special. Just a dark green blouse sea glass green, like in the manuscript, and black jeans. My hair in a simple braid, the way Francis used to do it when I was little. No makeup, no mask. I wanted them to see my face. All of it. The weight beneath my eyes. The steadiness in my jaw. The part of me they couldn't rewrite. Celia was already there when I arrived. She had reserved the big round table in the corner, the one near the window that looked out over the lake. The same table we sat at when I was 9, and they told me Santa Claus wasn't real right before giving my cousin a charm bracelet and handing me a used book with a torn cover. I sat down across from her. Then came Aunt Maggie. Then Cousin Theo. Then my uncle's second wife. Surprisingly. They came in slow, like hesitant pilgrims, unsure if this was a meal or a reckoning. I didn't welcome them. I didn't smile. I let the silence do the introductions. Celia opened her tote bag and handed each of them a printed copy of the manuscript, bound in a simple black folder. No title, no explanation. Just read this before dessert. Aunt Maggie raised an eyebrow. Is this some kind of statement? No, I said softly. It's history. My voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't angry, but it didn't shake either. She muttered something about theatrics, but opened it anyway. I watched their eyes as they moved down the first page, the way they stiffened, swallowed, reached for their water glasses like they needed something to ground them. By page 5, my uncle's wife was crying. Theo leaned back in his chair and whispered, "Holy shit." I let them read. I let the air grow heavy. I let the lake beyond the window shimmer with indifference. I wasn't here for pity. I was here to return what was stolen. When they were finished, no one spoke for a long time. Finally, Celia looked at me. Her voice was hushed. Did your mum know? I met her eyes. She donated the manuscript anonymously. The university records show it came from a Harper family trust dated 6 months after Daniel died. Maggie's fork clattered onto her plate. She hid it. Buried it, I corrected, along with my name, my father, and any version of me that didn't serve her narrative. Theo leaned forward. But, Richard, he raised you. He did, I said, and I don't regret that. But he wasn't mine. Not by blood. And they all knew. Every single one of them. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. Their faces said everything. You were our family, Maggie whispered. You are. I looked at her, really looked. Then, why was I never invited? She flinched. And then, in the silence, she said something I didn't expect. Because your mother told us not to. The table stilled. She said you didn't want anything to do with us. That you were distant, difficult, always tired or dealing with something. And we believed her. Because, well, she's your mother. No one defended her. No one spoke in her place. Not anymore. She curated my absence. I said, made it palatable, made it sound like it was for my own good. And you let her. They didn't argue. They couldn't. I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope I'd prepared, the one with the manuscript and birth certificate and property trust summary. I placed it in the centre of the table like a quiet bomb. I don't want anything from you. I said, not your forgiveness. Not your retroactive concern. Just your attention. For once. Then I stood, and just before I walked out, I turned and looked at Celia. I'm hosting a dinner next week. 1 table, no masks. Everyone's invited, including Francis. She nodded, and I left. Not triumphant, just whole. For the first time in years, I didn't hear from my mother for 5 days. Not a call, not a text, not even a silence-breaking emoji she sometimes sent after arguments, like a white flag in the shape of a flower. I wasn't surprised. She was never the kind to confront discomfort head-on. She preferred to retreat, to reframe, to wait until emotions faded into something manageable, something she could name and control. But this wasn't manageable anymore, and I wasn't something to be controlled. The invitation for my dinner had gone out through Celia. I hadn't sent it directly to my mother. I knew better. That invitation wasn't for her. It was for everyone else. To witness. To remember. I rented out a small inn on the edge of the lake, the same one where my father, Daniel, had once hosted a poetry reading before I was born. I found the photo in the archive folder that accompanied his manuscript, him standing by a wood-burning fireplace, holding a notebook, laughing into a crowd I couldn't see. I recreated it, almost exactly. There would be no performance, just a long wooden table, one envelope placed at each setting. Inside, a copy of the manuscript, a brief letter from me, and a photo of me and Frances, taken just 2 weeks ago in her garden. She's older now, but her eyes still gleam like she's seen every trick in the book and decided to rewrite the ending. I arrived early, lit the candles myself, checked the placements, looked at each name card with a strange calm. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't angry. I was anchored, heavy in my own body in a way I hadn't been since I was a child, waiting at the top of the stairs for my mother to notice me. They trickled in slowly. Celia first, then Theo, then Aunt Maggie, dressed in muted tones, her mouth drawn tight like she hadn't slept much. Others followed more than I expected. Old cousins, family friends, even 2 people I didn't recognise, who turned out to be children of Daniel's former colleagues. They had received the invitation through Frances, who had quietly reached out to everyone who had ever called Daniel Harper friend. And then, just before we were about to sit, she arrived. My mother. She wore navy blue, the same colour Frances had worn when she stepped out of the limo. Her hair was pulled back tight, face composed, not a single line out of place. She walked in without looking at me, sat at the far end of the table, her eyes scanning the setting like it was a courtroom. I didn't greet her, didn't acknowledge her presence more than I had to, because this wasn't her moment. It was mine. I stood at the head of the table, cleared my throat, spoke slowly. My name is Elise Harper. A few eyes widened. Celia gave the faintest nod. I've spent most of my life being told who I was, what I meant, where I belonged and where I didn't. But none of it was the full truth. My father was Daniel Harper. He died before I ever knew him, and no one told me, because they were ashamed, or afraid, or simply unwilling to face what didn't fit. I looked at each face, not seeking validation, just making sure they heard me. In your envelopes, you'll find what he left behind. Words, not wealth, not land, but memory. That's what this is, not revenge, not reclamation, just memory. Returned. I sat down, opened my envelope like everyone else. The silence stretched for several long minutes as pages turned and forks lay untouched. At one point, I glanced at my mother. She was still expressionless, but her hands trembled. When dinner ended, people left quietly. Some hugged me. Some didn't know what to say. Others asked if they could share the manuscript. I told them yes, that it belonged to more than me now. My mother was the last to rise. She walked over to the fireplace, stared at the photo of Daniel I'd framed above the mantel, then turned to me. And for the first time in my entire life, she didn't look like a mother. She looked like a woman, tired, beaten, still carrying secrets in her spine. I didn't know how to love you without him, she said. It was not an apology, but it was the closest thing she'd ever give me. I nodded. Then I walked past her, out into the night, where the lake waited in silence. The lake air was sharp that night, crisp with the breath of early autumn. I stood at the edge of the dock, barefoot, holding the hem of my blouse in one hand, as if grounding myself with something tangible. The sky above was streaked with stars, indifferent and ancient, and in that moment, I felt like I had stepped outside of time. Behind me, the last of the dinner guests drifted into cars and quiet goodbyes. I didn't turn to watch them. I wasn't interested in parting words, or in seeing which ones would hug my mother and which wouldn't. That wasn't the story anymore. It was never about punishment. It was about putting the truth somewhere it could no longer be buried. I heard footsteps behind me, soft on the dock. I didn't turn. "Thought you'd be out here," Frances said. Her voice carried gently over the water, like it had been shaped by it. She handed me a thin folder. Not the manuscript this time. Something new. "Estate papers," she said. "For your father." I tracked down what was left of his personal effects from the university. "It's not much, but there's something I think you should see." I sat down on the edge of the dock, opened the folder slowly, like I already knew it would hurt. Inside, there was a letter, unsent, dated 2 weeks before the crash, addressed to my mother. Frances sat beside me but said nothing. She just waited. I unfolded the page, hands steady. It read, "Clara, I won't fight you. If you want to raise Elise away from me, I won't drag you through court. But please, don't erase me. Don't pretend I didn't exist. One day, she'll need to know where her sadness comes from, where her music comes from, where her mind and her stubbornness and her quiet loneliness come from. That's all I ask. Let her know. Even if you hate me, don't take me from her memory. She's already lost a father. Please, don't make her lose the idea of one, two." Daniel, I didn't cry. I just stared at it, the words soft and final. A man's last plea to not be forgotten. And she ignored it. Or maybe she read it and couldn't bear the weight. Or maybe she folded it away. The way she folded away his shirts, his books, his name. Maybe that's what she did with everything that frightened her. Buried it inside me. I turned to Frances. "Did she ever tell you about this?" "No," she said. "But I knew. She couldn't look at you without seeing him. And that's why she hated me." Frances shook her head slowly. "She didn't hate you. She hated what she couldn't control. You were always going to find the truth. She just didn't know when." I nodded. Then, softly, I said, "I think I still loved her, even through all of it." Frances didn't respond right away. "Then that's the part she'll never understand. You loved her more honestly than she ever let herself love you." We sat in silence. The wind tugged at the surface of the lake, and somewhere an owl called. I folded the letter back into the folder and held it to my chest. Not like a weapon, like a photograph, a reminder of someone who had spoken gently into the void for a daughter he would never hold. The next morning, I mailed a copy of that letter to my mother. No note, no return address, just his words. Let her sit with them. Let her decide if she would bury this too, or finally let something grow from it. The letter reached her 3 days later. I know, because she called me at exactly 8 to 17 a.m., a time too early for drama, too late for indifference. I didn't answer. Let it ring until the sound faded into silence. Then I turned my phone off and placed it face down on the kitchen table. It wasn't out of malice. I simply didn't need to hear her version of the story. Not yet. Instead, I slipped on a jacket and walked down to the corner cafe, the one I used to visit after therapy when my heart was too swollen with revelations. I sat by the window and ordered chamomile tea, like my father wrote about in the manuscript. If she ever has trouble sleeping, give her chamomile. It worked for her mother. It might work for her too. The barista handed it to me with a smile, not knowing the weight that came with every sip. By noon, my voicemail had 3 messages. My mother's voice was strained in all of them. Controlled, but cracking in places. Elise. I got the letter. Pause. I didn't know you had it. Or maybe I did. Maybe I just hoped you wouldn't. Another pause. I never hated you. I just couldn't see him in you without drowning. The last message was the hardest. You were always more his than mine. That one stayed with me, because it was the truest thing she'd ever said. That evening, I visited Frances again. Her garden was in bloom lavender and bleeding hearts and thick green tomato vines crawling up makeshift trellises. She handed me pruning shears and we worked side by side, quietly, like women who'd shared grief before but no longer needed to speak it aloud. I want to publish the manuscript, I said suddenly, halfway through cutting a cluster of roses. Frances looked up. Under his name, no. I said, under mine, with a foreword that explains everything. Let people see what erasure looks like from the inside. She nodded slowly. Then, let's do it. I didn't tell anyone else, not Celia, not Theo, not even my therapist. I worked on it in silence, letting the manuscript take shape into something whole. I added footnotes where sentences trailed off. I kept the cross-outs. I kept the mess. I kept the ache. It was beautiful in its brokenness. 3 weeks later, I submitted it to a small literary press that specialised in posthumous memoirs and emotional nonfiction. I used the name Elise Harper. The bio was short. Elise Harper is a writer, researcher, and daughter of 2 ghosts. This is her first published work. I didn't expect it to be accepted, but it was. And when the galley proofs came in, I held the first printed copy in my hands like a newborn. My father's voice, alive again, stitched between mine, not as an echo, but as an answer. I ordered 12 copies, wrapped them in brown paper, wrote each name in ink. Celia, Theo, Maggie, Frances, my mother, and one, without a name, just for whoever needs to remember. I placed that last one in the little free library near my apartment, between a cookbook and a spy novel. It felt right. My mother didn't respond to the book, didn't write, didn't call again, but I heard through Celia that she read it twice and that she cried. I didn't want her tears. I wanted her silence to finally end. But maybe that, too, would take time. Maybe some wounds stay sore for the rest of a life. And maybe some truths don't demand repair, just recognition. That night, I lit a candle for my father, placed the original letter beside it, and whispered the words I had waited 3 decades to say. I found you. I didn't expect the book to spread. Not really, but it did. Quietly, organically, like grief passed from hand to hand. Within a month, a small online literary blog reviewed it, called it a haunting dialogue between father and daughter, one that transcends death, silence, and the limits of time. They titled the piece, "The Quiet Inheritance is Anything But Quiet." After that, more people began to reach out, not with praise, but with stories. Strangers, women mostly, who had grown up in the wrong name, under the wrong roof, feeling like shadows in their own homes. One woman wrote, I haven't spoken to my mother in 10 years. Your story made me realize I'm not cruel. I'm just tired of being rewritten. Another said, I always wondered why I felt like an outsider at my own family table. Turns out, there's a name for that feeling. It's called being erased. I didn't respond to all of them. I couldn't. But I read every message, because each one felt like a thread tying me to something bigger, something quiet and powerful, a sisterhood of hidden daughters, rising slowly from the footnotes of their families. I kept going to therapy. I kept working freelance. Nothing dramatic changed. But I changed. I started saying my name out loud, at coffee shops, at workshops, to new acquaintances, Elise, Harper, and each time I felt a tiny shiver, like I was putting skin on something that had always lived under glass. Francis and I spent more time together. We started organising Daniel's old boxes letters, drafts, scribbled notes on napkins. She wanted to donate them to a university archive, somewhere his legacy could live outside of closets and grief. I helped her catalogue each piece, holding paper that still smelled like old smoke and typewriter ink. Sometimes I cried, sometimes I didn't. One afternoon, while sorting a stack of lecture notes, Francis pulled out a faded index card. It had one sentence on it, in Daniel's handwriting. A child is not a legacy. A child is a whole world. I didn't speak. I just placed it in a small wooden frame and took it home. Meanwhile, the rest of the family remained complicated. Celia called often. She wanted to meet for brunch, for walks. She sent photos of her baby learning to crawl, always captioned with something like, "He has your stubborn eyes," or "I think he'll be the kind of kid who demands the truth." I appreciated her in a new way now, not for her guilt, but for her growth. Theo sent me an email. Short, simple. Just 3 words, "I see you." And that was enough. As for my mother, we didn't speak. Not really. But one morning, I received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a stack of photographs. Old ones. Most I'd never seen. Me as a toddler, playing in the grass. Daniel crouched nearby, looking at me like I was the only thing in the world. My mother in the background, holding a mug, half turned, half gone. There was no note, but in the last photo, someone had drawn a small heart in the corner with blue ink. Her way of saying something. I placed those photos in an album, one with a navy blue cover and a single word etched in gold foil. Begin. Not family. Not legacy. Just begin. Because that's what this was. Not a revenge story, not a takedown, not even redemption. Just a woman, standing in the ashes of a lie, building something new from the embers. I no longer needed them to understand me. I understood myself. That was enough. And for the first time, my past wasn't something I had to explain away. It was something I could carry lightly, truthfully, like a name I chose to keep. The day the book went into its second print run, I received an email from someone I never expected. The university, the one where Daniel taught. The subject line was simple. We remember. Inside was a formal request. They wanted to host a memorial lecture in his honour, the Daniel Harper series on hidden narratives. A panel of scholars, writers, and students who had read his manuscript and found something deeply personal within it. They wanted me to speak, not as a grieving daughter, as an author. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then, without overthinking, I typed one word, yes. It was scheduled for October. By then, the leaves would begin to change. And I wondered, as I always did in autumn, if loss became more visible when the trees let go of everything at once, when the world finally looked as fragile as we felt. The auditorium was small, modest, not grand or intimidating. It had old wooden chairs, a podium that creaked when touched, and sunlight that slanted in through tall glass windows, painting stripes across the stage like some kind of quiet blessing. Francis came with me. So did Celia. Even Theo showed up, awkward in his pressed shirt, hands shoved in his pockets like a kid waiting to be grounded. They sat in the front row, and then, 15 minutes before I was meant to go on, she walked in. My mother, dressed in grey, no expression. She didn't sit up front. She took a seat near the back, alone. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just looked at me with something heavy and unreadable behind her eyes. I took a deep breath, walked onto the stage, spoke into the microphone like I was speaking to a mirror. My name is Elise Harper, and I was raised to forget. That was how I began. And then, over the next 20 minutes, I unravelled my story, not as a spectacle, not as revenge, but as history. My history. The kind you piece together from whispers, from redacted files, from unsent letters. The room was still. When I finished, I didn't look at her. I looked at Francis, at Celia, at the girl in the third row who was crying softly into her sleeve. I walked off the stage, and just as I was reaching for my coat backstage, a voice stopped me. Elise. I turned. My mother stood there, hands shaking, eyes wide. I read it again. She said, "The manuscript, your book, all of it." I waited. She opened her mouth like she might say something else, then closed it. Then, quietly, she reached into her purse and pulled out a worn slip of paper, folded into fourths. I recognised it instantly. It was the letter from Daniel, the one I mailed her. She held it out to me. "I want you to keep it," she said. I didn't take it, not right away. Instead, I asked, "Why a beat?" And then, for the first time, she told me the truth. "Because you're the only one who never looked away from who he was." I took the letter, not as forgiveness, not as closure, but as fact. A small, fragile truth passed from hand to hand. She didn't hug me. I didn't ask her to. We stood there for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked back into the audience. I stepped out into the cold October air, the letter pressed flat against my chest, and I realised this wasn't an ending. It never was. It was the middle of something else. Something honest, and still unfinished. The morning after the lecture, I woke up before dawn, not out of anxiety, just peace. That quiet kind of wakefulness where nothing is chasing you anymore. No rehearsed conversations in your head, no longing for text messages that never come. Just you, breathing, alive, whole. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the city stretch its arms. The streets were still, the sky the colour of unspoken words. I thought of Daniel, of what he might say if he saw all of this. Not the lecture, not the book, but me, breathing deeply, standing in my own name. I pressed my palm flat to the window pane and whispered, "I'm still here." That afternoon, I visited the cemetery, not the Grayson family plot, not the one with its polished headstones and matching floral arrangements. I went to the modest one, tucked behind an old Methodist church 2 towns over, the one Francis had shown me months ago. Daniel was buried there. No grand epitaph, just his name, 2 dates, and a line carved by someone who clearly knew him. Words remain. I brought nothing but silence. No flowers. No rehearsed speech. Just a chair and a copy of the published book. I read to him, every page. I let my voice catch where it needed to. Let the breeze carry the vowels. Let the world hear what should have been said years ago. It felt like resurrection. And by the time I closed the book, I no longer felt like I was reading to someone gone. I was reading to the part of myself that had waited so long to be seen. Later that week, I held a gathering at my apartment. Small, just Francis, Celia, Theo, and Maya, the little girl who lived across the hall, whose mother worked nights and often left her with a tablet and dinner wrapped in foil. I had started watching her here and there, reading to her, teaching her to knit, letting her name the stray cat who kept wandering by my balcony. She called him Fig, because figs are soft, she said once, but they grow from hard places. That night, I made soup, lit candles, put on music that reminded me of my father's slow jazz, Nina Simone, the kind of songs you don't dance to but feel in your chest. We ate, we laughed, and when Maya fell asleep on the couch with her arms around Fig, Celia turned to me and said, "I've never seen you this still." I smiled, because I finally understood. Stillness wasn't absence. Stillness was arrival. This was the life they tried to erase. And yet, here it was, breathing, laughing, sleeping softly under my roof. I didn't need to reclaim my place in the Grayson family. I wasn't a Grayson. Not really. I was a Harper. A girl who came from a quiet man and a complicated woman. A girl who carried grief like a compass. A girl who built a home not from inheritance, but from truth. And in that truth, there was no need for revenge. Only recognition. Only love. Only this. A few weeks later, I received an invitation. A formal one. Heavy cardstock, gold foil lettering, sealed with the Grayson family crest like something out of a period drama. It made me laugh. A little. Of course they had a crest. Of course they were planning something polished. I opened it slowly. It was for a legacy gala, a fundraiser, an annual event to raise money for educational programs under the Grayson name. The same programs that had once excluded me. The same scholarships they denied me application support for in high school, claiming they were reserved for bloodline beneficiaries. And now my name was listed among the keynote guests. Elise Harper, author, editor, legacy contributor. That word sat strangely in my throat. I wasn't sure if it was an olive branch or a branding opportunity. Maybe both. Maybe neither. I set the invitation down beside my tea. Did I want to go? Did I need to? I let the question sit overnight. And in the morning, I RSVP'd yes, but on my terms. I arrived alone, wearing a dress in deep navy velvet. It was understated, elegant, and a little sharp at the edges. Like me. Frances helped me pick it out. She said it made me look like the storm after the silence. The event was held at the same lakeside estate, the Grayson house, the place I once watched from a parked car down the road, heart pounding with invisibility. Now I was walking up the front steps like I owned the ground beneath me. And in a way, I did. They'd chosen to forget the deed still carried my name. I was greeted by a polite woman with a clipboard and too much perfume. She didn't recognize me, but when I gave my name, her eyes shifted. "Oh," she said, straightening. "You're her..." I nodded. "Yes, I'm her inside." Everything was draped in gold and ivory. There were string quartets and hors d'oeuvres and people clinking glasses like the past didn't creak beneath the floorboards. But I wasn't there to make a scene. I was there to be undeniable. Celia found me first, hugged me so tight I could feel her heartbeat. Then Theo. Then others, more tentative. People who once looked past me, now glancing back with a softness that comes not from regret, but from slow awakening. And then my mother. She stood at the edge of the room, sipping something dark from a crystal glass. She didn't approach me. I didn't approach her. But we saw each other. That was enough. During the speeches, I was called to the front, introduced simply Elise Harper, whose recent publication has redefined the way we understand personal legacy and quiet strength. I stepped up. The microphone was cold in my hand. I took a breath. And then I said I was excluded from this family's history. Not by accident, but by design. But here's the thing about stories if you bury them long enough. They don't disappear. They just ferment. And when they rise, they're stronger than silence ever hoped to be. The room was still. But I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm not here for reconciliation either. I'm here because I exist. Because I have always existed, and no amount of omission can change that. I stepped down, no applause, just stillness, which, honestly, was better. Applause fades, but stillness sinks in. Later, as I slipped out the side door and into the cool night, I saw my mother standing by the lake, alone, looking out over the water like she was waiting for something to return. She didn't turn, and I didn't interrupt her. That was her silence to live in. I had already stepped out of mine. The next morning, I walked the lake path alone, not the manicured one near the estate, but the dirt trail on the other side, the forgotten edge, where roots jutted from the earth like questions left too long unanswered. It had rained the night before, and the earth was soft beneath my boots. The kind of soft that holds your weight without letting you sink. I walked slowly, no destination, just movement, just breath. There were no parties now, no eyes watching, no microphones, just trees and water and the faint memory of a man I never got to meet. I stopped where the trail widened into a clearing. A bench sat crooked under a weeping willow, warped with time and carved initials I didn't recognize. I sat there and closed my eyes, let the cold touch my face, let everything catch up to me. There was no grand feeling, no full circle cinematic climax, just stillness, just peace, but not the peace of forgetting, the peace of knowing. I thought about all the versions of myself I'd been, the child sitting quietly in family portraits, wondering why her mother's hand always hovered near, but never landed on her shoulder. The teenager with questions she was too afraid to ask, wearing borrowed dresses and second-hand shame. The young woman who searched court records at midnight, thinking maybe truth was just one more login away. The one who stayed silent for so long because she thought silence was love. I grieved for all of them. And then I let them go, not to forget, but to make space for who I had become. From the pocket of my coat, I pulled out something small, a smooth, flat river stone. Francis had given it to me earlier that week, along with a note that read, "Some legacies are written in ink, others in stone." I had etched one word on it: remain. I walked to the edge of the lake and placed it gently at the base of the willow. No plaque, no grand gesture, just a whisper of presence, a quiet declaration that I had been here, that I had endured, that I was no longer afraid to take up space in a story I was born into. As I stood, I heard footsteps behind me. Soft, hesitant, I turned slowly. It was my mother. She wore a long coat, no makeup, her hair pinned back the way she used to when she worked nights at the clinic. She looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was just finally standing at my full height. She didn't speak. Not at first. She looked past me, at the stone, at the lake, at the tree we used to picnic under when I was little, back when things were simpler, before secrets calcified into structure. I used to bring you here when you were a baby, she said. Her voice was low, careful. Before I told anyone about the marriage, before I changed your name. I didn't interrupt. She kept talking. You used to hold acorns in your fist, wouldn't let them go, even in your sleep. A long silence. I thought if I could raise you quietly, if I could keep you safe from his memory, maybe you'd be easier to love. There it was. Not cruelty, not even confession, just the raw, misshapen truth of a woman who tried to rewrite grief with control. I nodded, slowly. I would have loved you either way, I said. She closed her eyes. I know that now. The wind rustled through the leaves. She stepped closer. Not too close. Just enough to stand in the same clearing. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I'm not offering it, I replied gently. I'm offering the truth. Her eyes met mine then, and for the first time, there was no defensiveness, no wall, just two women, standing in the wreckage of a story neither of them asked to inherit. I don't want to be written out again, she said. Then don't vanish, I said. Just be here, in the story, as you are. She looked down at the stone, then nodded once, as if that were a promise. We stood there a while, not speaking, not mending, just being. When we finally turned back toward the path, she didn't walk behind me. She walked beside me. For the first time, not leading, not chasing, just walking, each of us holding the silence differently now. It's been a year since the reunion I never attended. 12 months since the limo door opened and Frances stepped onto that porch like a ghost wearing her own name. Since the manuscript was printed. Since Daniel Harper was spoken aloud again in the family that tried so hard to erase him, and me along with him. And now I live in a small house on the other side of the lake. It's not grand, just 2 bedrooms, a garden that grows wild no matter what I do, and a screened-in porch where I write most mornings with a mug of tea warming my palms. I bought it with the advance from the second book, not a memoir, not a follow-up, something else entirely, fiction. But even fiction tells the truth, in its own way. Sometimes I wonder if Daniel would have liked the house. I think he would have. There's a crooked bookshelf I built myself, filled with poetry, a record player that hisses before the music, and windows that face the water, always just a little fogged in the morning-like memory, soft around the edges. Frances visits once a week. She brings clippings from her garden, small jars of jam, stories from the years when she was gone from the family, but never really far from me. We don't talk about the Graysons much, not anymore. Not out of bitterness, but because we no longer need them to define us. Some stories are finished, even if the characters keep living. Celia calls every other day. She sends voice notes of her toddler trying new words. The latest one is harp. I smiled when she said it, wondering if that sound will ever stop rippling through generations. Probably not. Theo moved out west. Sent me a postcard last month with a photograph of a canyon and a quote from my book scribbled in the corner. Even silence has roots. And my mother. She's still learning how to be in the world without editing it. She comes over sometimes. She doesn't stay long. But she brings little offerings, a photo, a story I never heard. Once even a cake she baked from my grandmother's old recipe, the one she once swore she'd never make again. She never apologizes. I never ask her to. Instead, we sit on the porch, talk about the weather, the garden, the cat who still hasn't let me name him. Sometimes we say nothing at all, and it's enough, because now silence doesn't mean shame. It means space. It means peace. It means breathing without bracing. Sometimes Maya comes by after school. She brings her backpack, drops it by the door, and immediately climbs into the chair beside mine with a book and a cookie and a string of questions that never really have answers. "Why do people lie?" she asked last week. I looked at her and said, "Because they're afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid of the truth being bigger than they can hold." She nodded, like she understood. Then she whispered, "But you held it." Right, and I realised I had all of it. The absence, the inheritance, the ache, the name. I held it, not because I was strong, but because I had to. Because someone had to remember. Because the truth, no matter how long it stays buried, deserves daylight. One evening, I returned to the willow tree by the lake. The stone I'd left was still there, moss creeping over the carved word, "Remain." I smiled, then pulled a second stone from my pocket. This one was smaller, etched with one word, "Begin." I placed it beside the first. Not as an ending, but as a quiet acknowledgement that I had survived the exclusion, not by crashing through the door, but by building a new one with my name on it, not in spite of them, but without needing them at all. The past didn't vanish. It stayed, as it should, but so did I, not waiting anymore, just living.